Well, howdy, everybody in Facebook land, Committed 100. Welcome back to Church History with Moi. Hopefully, you guys were with us for the first hour in systematic theology. A rather enjoyable time, at least for me. Hopefully, you guys got your pens, your paper, your highlighters, hopefully, you guys have binders with your notes. Or notepads, whatever it is you're using. As we today pick up where we left off in church history, just past the Munster Rebellion, and picking up a more notable character in the Reformation period of John Calvin. And I know all you Baptist folks are going crazy. Oh, how dare Chris talk about John Calvin? Oh, what a heretic. He's burning in hell, etc., etc., etc. Let's look at John Calvin in the light of history and be willing to accept that there have been people throughout church history that didn't look like us, didn't talk like us. You got to remember, John Calvin was a Frenchman. Oh, yes, holy frog, no? Is a Frenchman. And we have to realize that the Reformation was out of the Catholic Church, and that immediately it didn't look like First Southern Baptist of wherever. That there was a process in which God used to take us out of the Roman Catholic Church into what we are today. And so we need to be willing to accept that, willing to look at Calvin's thoughts and ideas on face value and realize that we didn't get to where we are on day one. With that, let's hop in and look at Calvin. John Calvin, born 1509. You got to remember, John Calvin is what we would call a second generation reformer. He was born as the fruits of, 1509, 1510 is when Luther was in Rome and seeing the corruption and the teaching that was going on in Rome and starting the beginnings of the Reformation in his mind. What would become the impetus in 1517 for posting the 99 Theses. So we have to realize that this took time. The things aren't the way they are today, where you post something in Facebook and it goes viral within 2 days and everybody in the world knows. The world was quite different in the 16th century. Things often took, like the Reformation, decades to, number one, not only start, but to take hold and to have the conversations of what is it that we actually believe. John Calvin, originally born in what's called Lower or Middle French, Jehun Chauvin, was born in 1509 in France. Yes, he was a frog, no? He attended college at the College of La Marche, and he focused on Latin. You got to remember, John Calvin, much like people of his day, with the real beginnings of solid universities and colleges, the emphasis was on more of the well-rounded man, or mainly men. More rounded men, what we would call the Renaissance men, the men that knew a little bit of astronomy and medicine and law and rhetoric and philosophy, rather than the modern conception is that you first go to school in your undergraduate degree to get a wide-ranging education, math, English, science, and then a little bit about your focused area of eventually expertise. It wasn't like today where when you went to graduate school or when you went to seminary, was then the laser focus on a specific area. Like many seminaries, you go for your master's in divinity. Now there's a concentration. Are you concentrating on pastoral ministry? Are you counseling on counseling? Are you focusing on biblical languages? Are you focusing on teaching the Gospels or church history? Or some schools have 20 or 30 different concentrations in which you can laser focus in on your study. It wasn't so much so in the 16th century. Now, yes, Calvin, as he's growing up, he focuses on Latin in what we would call, this was actually really high school, our equivalency of high school for him, in which he focused on Latin. He continued schooling at the Collège de Montaigu, in which his dad was really forcing him to study law, because there wasn't 401ks or retirement programs in those days. And so as a father, your best retirement program is to have your son go into a profession and make good money, such as law, or even still at that time, going into the priesthood could allow you to make money because you could get benefits. Remember, we've talked about that before, in which you were paid by those that were under you for their positions. His dad moved him from there to the University of Orleans to study law. When looking at John Calvin's educational history, it makes me not as ashamed of the fact that I've gone to several different schools and not finished my degree at each and every one of them, because we quickly see that Calvin goes to about 5 different colleges throughout his career. And the first 3, he doesn't finish his degree at. He doesn't finish his law degree until much later. So he's studying at the University of Orleans to study law. But it's not just law. Specifically, he was there to study what we would call rhetoric, the ability to think and to argument, as well as study law, but also to continue his, what we would call humanism streak. Now, humanism in that day meant something totally different than humanism today. Once again, it was that idea of being more well-rounded, of being a little bit adept in each of the areas of study. He moves again to the University of Bourges in 1529 to study humanism and law. But while at Bourges, he learns Koine Greek. So he knows French, he knows Latin. Now he's learning Greek, and eventually Calvin will also learn Hebrew. So he is really the language man. He knows be able to interpret and to read both the Old Testament and New Testament in both Hebrew and Greek. Super important, especially in his day. We have to remember, right at this same time, we have people such as, you've got the printing of the Novum Testamentum, or the Novum Instrumentum, the first version. You've got people beginning, such as Luther and Calvin's successors, that they in turn both create translations of the Old and New Testaments in the language of the people. John Calvin is converted. Now, there's a bit of an argument here about when Calvin is converted from Roman Catholicism into something else. Now, what wasn't mentioned in the slide is that Calvin, for a time, toyed with going into the church. In fact, his dad had arranged for him to be a secretary of sorts for a bishop. And then he eventually becomes basically a notary public for one of the larger churches with a connected school. So there's this underlying religiousness of the Calvin or Chauvin family. Yet as he writes about his conversion experience, some people say 1529, some say 1530, some people say as late as 1532 or 1535. But no matter what year it was, this is what he had to say about it. God, by a sudden conversion, he was religious before that. And yet now he's saying, I was religious before, but I've been converted. I have been changed by what? By the work of God. Subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame. And in other words, he got beat down by the gospel message, by the Spirit himself, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. In other words, his heart was so hardened, even in an early age of life, that the Spirit really needed to work on him to get through the reality of the gospel message. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, he had seen people around him that he had considered godly people. I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress in godliness, to make a desire towards knowing God and serving God and loving God, that although I did not altogether leave off other studies, yet I pursued them with less ardor. In other words, he was studying law, but now that he's been converted, he puts those worldly things aside and then focuses on the truth. Being exceedingly alarmed at the misery into which I had fallen, and much more than that which threatened me in the view of eternal death, I, duty-bound, made my first business to betake myself to your way, condemning my past life, not without groans and tears, in other words, repentance. But now, O Lord, what remains to a wretch like me, but instead of defense, earnestly to supplicate, to submit, you not to judge that fearful abandonment of your word according to its deserts, from which in your wondrous goodness you have at last delivered me. This sounds, in my estimation, in words of a converted man who understood his position before Christ and his position after Christ. No matter the remainder of his theology, and whether you agree with it or not, this is a confession of the death, burial, resurrection of Christ, and of a conversion process from religiousness to faith. Calvin's father dies before he finishes his law degree in 1532. I believe it's the next year he completes his law degree. But yes, he finishes law and his studies in Latin and Greek and the classical languages. But then his first book that he publishes is on Seneca's De Clementia, which is in itself a commentary. Already his mind is focused, it's sharp. Calvin was a good student, fastidious, thorough, and as he receives his law degree, and basically we would call him an esquire, in other words, someone with a law degree that maybe does or does not practice law. Instead, his focus then is on religious things, Christian things. Calvin's reforms started early after his conversion. He begins a friendship with Nicolas Cop and Louis du Tillet, not toilet, Tillet, who began political maneuvers to magisterially reform France. We have to remember there's a reason why when we talk about first, second generation reformers, we talk of them as being magisterial reformers. What does that mean? They wanted to change the system rather than abandoning the system and starting fresh. Luther wanted a magisterial or a sacral church, in the same way Calvin wanted to remain a sacral church that had just reformed. This is where the Reformation, I think, could have taken hold of better if they would have understood the necessity of not trying to change the system of both the secular, legal, or governmental systems and the church, rather than abandoning both and starting a new church separate from the marriage between the church and the state. Calvin, like Zwingli and Luther, all played, at least for a time, with a free church. But because of the way the system was, and because of their thoughts, they really thought that they could reform the church from the inside and still continue to have a sacral church married to the state, so that the church and the state had equal powers, and in many cases those powers overlapped. He wanted to reform France. He and his buddies were adamant about this new Reformation, and I'm sure, by 1529, the Reformation is in full swing by the time Calvin gets to it. There's already been diets and meetings and condemnations of those such as Luther for his reforming of Germany. Calvin wants the same for France, or is what was happening in Geneva. Coppe and Calvin are implicated in a pro-Reformation speech at the College Royal. The first speech of the season. Calvin's friend Coppe gets up and gives a rather fiery condemnation of the sacral church, and of specifically the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. Because of that, they've got to go in hiding. There's literally a bounty on their heads after this presentation, because France, like many other nations, had so married itself to the Roman Catholic Church that they derived especially the royal powers in and from the Catholic Church, in which the treaties and letters between the Vatican and France, giving the monarchy their power, was not something that was going to be done away with. It would take a later revolution to undo it. But those marks, that sacral nature, still lies in France today. It's not fully gone away. Now, yes, France is becoming more and more secular. But for the ties still back to the Roman Catholic Church are immense. Calvin has to go in hiding for about a year after this announcement. He lays low and continues writing. But his friend Coppe flees to Switzerland, Basel, in which is much freer in their choice of your beliefs. There's a freedom in politics. There's a freedom in religion in Basel at the time. But Calvin goes into hiding. Then we move forward just a little bit to 1534, and what's called the affair of the Packards or Placards. A phrase comes out of this, that you are a Picard. No, not Star Trek, not Jean-Luc Picard. Although I think that had a little bit to do with the choosing of his name by Gene Roddenberry. The affair of the Packards, posters against the Mass. transubstantiation, the propitiatory sacrifice, the whole mass was rallied against with posters all over France by many of those who wanted reform, both politically and religiously in France. Thankfully, not many were killed, but a lot of them were jailed, beaten, and discouraged from continuing or chased out of France, such as John Calvin. It became a very hostile place for those who wanted reform, those that were a part of this affair, and those that would then be deemed as traitor were called Picards, as we'll see in a little bit. So we see that in October 1534, Calvin flees France to join Cop in Basel. Or that's his goal, at least. He's being chased out of France for his reformational views, or what would be called radical views. We see then 2 years later, as he's fled France, and he already started work in the previous year, he publishes his first version, smaller, much more condensed, what's called the Institutes of Religion. Mine's packed away somewhere. I've got the second version of it. The Institutes of Religion becomes the bedrock of his teaching. He would say later, forget what I've written in letters or what I've said publicly. If you want to really know what I believe, look to the Institutes. This is going to be important later as he deals with a known heretic. What are some of the negatives about this statement of faith? This Institutes of Religion. In other words, Calvin had written the Institutes as basically what we call catechism or catechism, or in other words, a tool in which you use to help teach new Christians what it is we believe. Some of the negatives about Calvin's Institutes were a continuation of infant baptism, although his reasoning for doing so isn't quite yet what we would call covenantal infant baptism. It is somewhere in between the baptism, so to make them saved, like the Catholic Church was teaching, and somewhat of the elements of what we would call covenantal infant baptism. But that's a long process in which Calvin doesn't finish that process. It's going to be third and fourth generation reformers, especially Melanchthon and others, that then really put the stamp on covenantal infant baptism. Then also in the Institutes, Calvin does not, much like the Anabaptists or Zwingli and others, take a memorialistic view of communion. He plays with the language and the understanding of not necessarily transubstantiation, like Catholic Church, the priest calling down Jesus from heaven, placing him inside of the wafer, and corpus corpus meum, this is my body. But it's also not consubstantiation, where yes, the wafer and the juice are wafer and juice, but the spiritual presence of Christ is in the communion. He kind of takes a middle ground between the two. And I've always had a hard time exactly following Calvin in his understanding of communion, because it's between kind of those two, not extremes. That's kind of both consubstantiation and transubstantiation are kind of on the left-hand side, what I would call out in the back 40, versus a more memorialistic view being way on the right. Calvin's kind of lost in limbo between the two. Also, what's presented in the Institutes is still a sacral church. is still wanting a church that is tied to the state and the power in which the state brings to the church. Unfortunately, he really didn't want, in my opinion, a free church. Much like the Anabaptists and Quakers of following generations wanted. But what are some of the positives that comes out of the Institutes and Calvin's teaching? Well, Calvin was even a kind of a rebel in his day. He presented a whole Bible concept, what Dr. Howard would call a whole Bible concept. Is that Calvin was strange. He didn't do liturgy in that sense. He didn't do homilies much like the homilies of today, of taking newspaper clippings and talking about the events of the current day. He preached verse by verse through books of the Bible, which was odd for the time, which seemed, even in his day, to be old-fashioned. Man, what does that make Dr. Howard and I? But what also is presented, not necessarily by name, but by concept, are what's called the solas of the Reformation. The onlys, shall we say in English. Sola gratia, by grace alone that you're saved. A lot of these were started by Luther and continued with the second and third generation reformers. That is by grace you are saved. Look in Ephesians chapter 2. It is only by faith, sola fide, only by faith, not by your works, not by going to Mass or going to confession or the sacramental system. Sola Scriptura, the Bible and the Bible alone. Yes, Calvin was strong on the Bible and the Bible alone, but it didn't necessarily play out in all of the areas of his theology. Sola Christus, Christ and Christ alone is our Savior. Not Mary, not the saints, not the treasury of merit in heaven. There isn't such a thing. And then sola de gloria, or sola gloria, to the glory of God alone. This is the area, especially in which I think Calvin and the Institutes, much like Luther had started 2 decades before, was giving God the glory in salvation and in his work in mankind. Not man being supreme, as we would see with an Origen or mainly I'll place it at Origen's feet. But we see that there's this overwhelming, God gets the glory for his work in the church and for his work in individuals. While Calvin is out of France, there is an edict that is declared that there's a 6-month cool down period on those that were kicked out of France, whether for political or religious reasons. But as well as there's the 6-month cool down, there's also at the end of this 6 months, either you're going to reconcile with the Catholic Church or you're going to leave France. Forcing once again the issue, Calvin had continued to want to stay in France and to minister in France. But the climate and the people, especially after this edict, made it impossible. So Calvin intends to flee to Strasbourg. So he spends some time in Switzerland. He wants to go to Strasbourg, but because of war, France and dealing with some of their neighbors, he's redirected to Geneva. And originally, his plan was to just spend 1 night in Geneva. Well, as he shows up in Geneva, his institutes have been printed for a number of years at this point. And while Calvin is there very shortly in his journey in Geneva, he bumps into Willem Farel. He's pastor of the local church there in Geneva, who's starting the process of Reformation because, once again, there's freedom in Switzerland, in a sense. He's helping to lead the council, the city council, and starting these reforms in the church. For now, they're going along with it. He has a copy of the Institutes, and he knows about Calvin. And after talking with Calvin, he's begging Calvin to stay to help him co-minister and to continue the reforms there in Geneva. He says, I can't do it alone. You're the bigger mind. I'm just the preacher. You're the bigger mind. You can argue with the city council in a way that they will have to go with the direction of reform here in Geneva because you're just so doggone smart. Now, this kind of puts Calvin in an odd position. Calvin would really like to go back to France, but that's kind of not an option. Calvin is actually on his way to go to his friends, to go see Coupe and help continue reforms in a different part of Switzerland. And yet, Calvin ends up staying in Geneva. Helps Farel really start the Genevan Reformation. In 1536, he's so smart and he knows and understands. He's trained in law, right? He's got the legal and the theological. It kind of reminds me of a friend of ours in Southern California who's got both the legal and the theological. He writes articles on the organization of the church and its worship at Geneva. This is a long-winded presentation of basically articles of incorporation for the town council there in Geneva, for them to adopt and to basically to become reformed by definition and by what we would call the articles of incorporation of the town itself. It's a combination of theology and law, but once again, Calvin and Farel and others are wanting to reform the church in and through the power of the state. The sacral church is still at work, versus in the first century, we don't see the church wanting to reform the culture or to reform the government. We see them wanting to give out the gospel. And so there's a misunderstanding of the magisterial reformers as to the true nature of reform, true nature of the gospel message that does not require the state, nor should it. Geneva aligns with France in 1536. They become buddies, both mainly in war with neighboring lands that, especially with Spain, as Spain is becoming more and more Islamic, and the threat of Islam, but also the threat of Islam from the south as well. Geneva aligns with France. Now, that's just the town, not the whole nation, but Geneva. They were a independent, shall we say, a country within a country. They were large enough to have their own charter and their own leadership to where they could align with France, which put pressure on Farel and Calvin to, Geneva's aligning with France militarily, but also then theologically. Once again, that pressure to return back to the mother church, the Roman Catholic Church, is always on the back burner. Calvin is invited to pastor a church of French speakers in Strasbourg. There had been enough people with the, shall we say, exodus in France at the Edict of Clichy that there's a lot of French speakers in Strasbourg. So with the pressure of Geneva going along with France and the eventual expulsion of reformers, either you make up with the mother church and with the Pope, or you bail. Calvin's invited to go to Strasbourg. Geneva regrets losing Calvin, but makes arrangements with Strasbourg to borrow Calvin for 6 months. So while Calvin's in Strasbourg, it's a great time pastorally of growth, in which he enjoys ministering to the people in his own language, in French. But Geneva wants to borrow Calvin. And so from 1541 to 1544, the plague is just raging through, as it had for centuries before it, but is raging through Europe. And no less than 4 times during this period, and sometimes several times in a year, the plague hits Geneva, killing up to 1/3 of the total populace by the 4th year. Calvin himself gets a form of the plague, but recovers. This is where many in Geneva are fleeing, because you got to remember, Geneva is large. They think that if they leave the big city, that they will somehow escape the plague that's roaming through Europe. Calvin gets the plague while ministering to the people of the city. This garners him great reputation with the community. But ever since he's bout with the plague, Calvin's not the same. Calvin, post-plague, is kind of sickly. By this time, he's in his 30s. The plague has left him winded, shall we say, and he just never the same post the plague. Calvin continues to write and to have interaction with people like Zwingli and Luther and Melanchthon and Butzer and pretty much everybody that we've talked to, anybody that was still alive, up to and including some of the Anabaptists, or those that we would call forget the term for them, but Calvin at least was willing to have a conversation with other reformers and see where they were. Now, this becomes interesting once he starts talking to a known heretic, in which John Calvin is placed at the head of making sure that this particular heretic died. But we're going to look into that starting next week. Next week, we'll pick up where we left off at just past the plague, Calvin and the plague, and move into his later years of ministry between Geneva and Strasbourg. And then see, is John Calvin the deciding factor of why Miguel Servetus, is John Calvin really to blame for Servetus's being burned at the stake? Well, to find out, you need to tune in next week. Make sure you guys stay tuned for a fun and enjoyable time with from that pastor's perspective. Daylight today, actually hosted by Dr. Howard, and looking forward to having, sounds like a long list of Committed 100 pastors on today. Hopefully this has been a blessing, maybe shed some light as to the person and work of Calvin. And don't dismiss him as a false teacher or heretic yet. Let's continue to look at what actually he taught and actually his role, especially with Servetus, and then look at history in light of that, not necessarily what we've been taught in church. I was taught in the church that my grandparents brought me to, that just on face value, that Calvin was a heretic and a false teacher, and he killed Servetus is kind of the top thing in the list against Calvin. Well, then in looking actually at the record of church history, reading the Institute for myself, reading of the history of those that interacted with Calvin, changed my opinion. So don't just take everybody or especially your church's word for it, because sometimes that's based on certain prejudices that have been there, in this case, for centuries, because of events in history that may or may not be warranted. Anyways, with that, see you guys in a few minutes for Daylight. May God bless you richly is my prayer as we continue to study the systematic theology, church history, and have our pastoral discussions on Daylight. See y'all in a few.